Walter, thank you once again for inviting me to be part of your conference. And I'm delighted to be here this morning to examine the economic situation in Ukraine. As you see from your agenda, this panel will focus on grading the economic performance of Ukraine. But before we start, I'd like to just make a few opening remarks to put this a little bit in context. You can't separate economics from politics, and politics obviously plays a key role in terms of how Ukraine's economy has progressed over the past few years and how it will continue to progress. And if you look at the political situation in context, you will notice that Ukraine has had a number of political revolutions, so to speak, over the years since its independence. You can point to December of 1991, when Ukraine's population overwhelmingly voted for independence in the referendum. Then, of course, in this century, we've had the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, all of which led to a promise of reform, of movement forward. Unfortunately, one of the drawbacks that you've had in that situation is that the ruling class came to the fore once again in each one of those revolutions. What you have now is a new political situation which promises the development of a new economic situation. What do I mean by new? In April of this year, you had another revolution, so to speak, political revolution in Ukraine, in which the population overwhelmingly, close, I guess it was 73% of the population voted for President Zelensky, which the vote obviously was a condemnation of all the policies of the past, an expression of hope to really help move Ukraine forward. But the major change in this political revolution is that you brought someone to the office from outside the political class. While all the previous presidents, most have been very well-meaning and dedicated in moving Ukraine forward into the Western fold, this president comes outside of the tradition of the political base that existed in Ukraine. In other words, previous presidents were all part of the ruling political class. This president, for the first time, indicates the possibility of being outside that political class and moving forward. Having said that, this president does face a number of challenges. Obviously, there's the challenge of dealing with the oligarchic class and the traditional constraints that have operated on Ukraine's economy. Then there's the challenge of Russian aggression, and of course, there's the challenge of moving Ukraine closer toward Western Europe. And the last and not least the challenge is that of the parliamentary elections. Those, to a great extent, will judge how the president's going to be able to move forward. In short, what I'm saying is that Ukraine's past economic performance, while it left a lot to be desired, the current administration promises to maybe move forward dramatically, because we have not only a new president outside of the old ruling political class, but also a strong mandate from the population to move forward. While the presidents have had mandates in the past, unfortunately, a lot of them have not been able to move the ball forward too much. Anyway, this morning we have three experts that will assess the past performance of Ukraine's economy and kind of hopefully take a look at what needs to be done to move the country forward. I'm pleased to note that with us this morning is Åslund, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and an expert on Ukraine's economy and advisor to Ukraine's government on the economic situation. We also have Aleks from the Sovereign Venture, who is a partner in Sovereign Ventures, which does a number of business deals in Ukraine, therefore bringing a very practical bird's-eye view of the situation regarding business and economics in Ukraine. And Mehrle. Matthew serves as an instructor at the Columbia University in the field of international politics. He also brings the expertise of having served in various capacities as a DAS, Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Commerce Department under President Obama. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to our experts, get their opinions, and then we'll turn it over to possible questions from the audience. We'll go in alphabetical order. Anders will start, then we'll have Aleks, and then Matthew. Anders?
Thank you very much, Roman, and thank you, Walter, for being invited here once again. What I thought I should do quickly is to say what have the achievements been, because they have been there already for some time and therefore look pretty safe right now. Ukraine has today a reasonable tax system. Public expenditure a bit over 40% of GDP, It should be 35% if you look upon Romania, Lithuania, Bulgaria in the neighborhood, but it's not over 50% as it was before the revolution of dignity. And the big change in the tax system has been cutting down the payroll tax from 45% on average to 22%, which Natalia Jaresko and Prime Minister Atjunct did. Another big thing is, of course, the energy reforms, doing away with 6% of GDP in subsidies that essentially went to probably 3 people. And that was the biggest corruption hole. The Prosoro public procurement system that they now claim saves about 1% of GDP each year. These are very important things. The central bank has a solid reputation. It has closed 100 out of 180 banks. Unfortunately, the state of the banking system is still pretty terrible. More than 50% non-performing loans, which is not at all good. And this means that the banks are not giving credits. When they are giving credits, given a base rate of the central bank of 17.5%, inflation is still 9%, which is too high. So they have to maintain very high interest rates. That means that a commercial credit costs 22 to 23%, which means that commercial credits are not taken. The banks have too much liquidity and too large NPLs. This remains a very unhealthy banking system, and the part of it is that state banks dominate now. State banks are 58% of the banking assets, and this is almost as bad as in Russia. So the banking system remains a big problem, while monetary policy looks reasonably secure. I'm actually on the board of the Ukrainian railroad, Åslund, since for 1 year now. And the reason why 8 big state companies now have supervisory boards with independent directors in majority is that EBRD told the Ukrainian government, we are not going to give any money to anybody if you don't have a board with a majority of independent members. And Prime Minister Groisman at the same time utilized this to take control over the state companies away from the branch ministries, which I think is very sensible. This means that the branch ministries don't run state companies as if they are a part of their ministries any longer, but the ministries become more regulatory as they should be in a normal economy. And hopefully this will have a good positive effect. So it's a combination of Prime Minister Groisman and EBRD and young CEOs in these companies that are coming through. We are seeing now a very positive thing, that there are tens of thousands of young Ukrainians with Western education that are available. And this has created a completely different ground for doing reforms and for doing everything. So what should we have as a target now? As Ambassador Popadiuk mentioned, it's less straightforward economics. It's more what goes out in the political sphere and into the judicial sphere. But strictly in the economic sphere, there are 2 big things that needs to be done. One is to allow private sales of agricultural land, which would do wonders to clean up the banking system, because then there would be land as collateral, and agriculture could develop much faster for that reason also. So this is really a major change that could happen. Zelensky has it on his program, but it has been very unpopular all the time, because ordinary people think that if they will be allowed to sell the land, it will be taken away from them. That's the simple, popular understanding, which is not altogether wrong, but they have to be convinced that they can keep the money if they sell the land. The other the big thing that hasn't been done is privatization. Ukraine still has more than 3,000 state enterprises, and most of these are of little or no value and should be gotten out of the way. They are simply blocking the economy. Only in the last year the government has got this into order. For a long time they tried to privatize the biggest, most valuable companies with lots of vested interests, and of course failed every time. So now instead they have started selling on prosoro small assets. You can say that this is typically unfinished construction and such things of little value, and they have managed to sell off several hundred of these. So this is a completely different situation. 75% of the prosoro privatizations function now. The big problem in the Ukrainian economy is property rights. Say that the Ukrainians take out about 4% of GDP in net capital outflows each year. Ukrainian assets abroad are assessed as about as large as the Ukrainian GDP, something like $130 billion. And you can easily see when you talk to wealthy Ukrainians, they are more concerned about their reputation abroad than what happens to their business in Ukraine. So they are sort of living in a raunchy economy instead. And foreigners see this. For the last 5 years, real foreign direct investment has been about 1% of GDP each year. It should be 4 or 5% of GDP or more. And the reason is that foreigners see what the locals are doing. So Ukraine therefore has an investment ratio of 20%, where it should be 28 to 30%. This is the big difference. This is the difference between 3 to 7 or 7% growth rate. The free trade agreement with the European Union, I think, has been a major success. 20 years ago, Ukraine had only 10% of its exports going to the European Union. Now it's 43%. So the free trade agreement really worked, and this increases all the time. But back to what should be done about the property rights. In principle, it's easy. There are 3 bodies that need to be fixed. The prosecutor's office, I guess that Matthew will talk about these things, the courts, and SBU. So Regress talked about SBU that is doing a lot of good things. Well, the counterintelligence is doing good things. But they have an economic crime department of 8,000 people who should just be laid off. The SBU should not deal with economic crime. I'm not aware of any significant case that they have pursued, while there's abundant stories of their corporate trading that they are pursuing. The other very problematic institution is the Prosecutor General's office, which has 18,000 people, and we have now seen 3 Prosecutor Generals in a row after a revolution of dignity that have not pursued any good course in any regard. Regress talked about that also, so I'm not going to repeat it. But the big thing is corporate levy. And then the third thing is the courts. Here we have seen substantial improvement with the new appointment of Supreme Court judges, but almost 1/4 of them did not pass through the integrity test. These people should be taken out. They should not be allowed to be judges. And I hope that this will happen with the new government. I should just say a couple of things here. What Zelensky has started doing. First, you need to have new elections. That's obvious. France, for example, naturally has new elections 2 months after a new president has been elected. What the constitution says, a constitution mainly written by Medvedchuk and interpreted by a constitutional court that enjoys no reputation after it abolished the constitution in October 2010, is not really relevant. It should be the essence of a substance rather than a poorly construed constitution that is not interpreted by authoritative sources. And he has started by sacking the top of SBU, which is very important, and also the regional heads of SBU, who are widely considered to be involved in organized crime activities in the regions. And also change the regional governance. So these are exactly the things that you would like to see if a new president is coming in. He needs to take command and get things done. And he has not so far touched the National Bank or the Minister of Finance or the foreign policy institutions. Right? So these are things that you think should not be touched. So it looks promising, but of course most is there to be seen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So I spoke here last year, and I'll touch on some of those comments today, referencing back to them. They were a little prescient, I think, but not because I'm a mind reader, but because the problem in Ukraine is pretty obvious at a macro level. And then I'll talk about solutions. I think Ambassador Popadiuk said at the outset that economics and politics are intertwined. That's true everywhere. It's particularly true in countries where the business climate and really the business elite needs to be completely reoriented and in some places replaced if they don't change. Because of their own volition, they'll continue doing what they're doing, which is making money the way that they've been making money, unless there's a reason for them to stop, right, and stop and change. And that's where the political environment has to come in, or a revolution, right? Ukraine has now 3 times effectively had a revolution in 15 years. I consider the Zelensky election a revolution, just a peaceful one, because they said, well, this isn't working. So last year, around June of this time, President Poroshenko had come out. I think there was a big Washington Post article where he talked about, we're about to take anti-corruption reform seriously. It sounded great, and my comments were about, well, let's see what happens. Let's see if he does that. Let's see if he reorients the country, helps reorient the businesses. And ultimately, that means reorient the businesses away from the current ruling elite if they don't change significantly. So effectively, the job of a good Ukrainian president will be to disenfranchise the people who have been running and benefiting from the country, one way or another. They can still benefit, but they can no longer run it, because it's not theirs. It's a country like any other country that should be governed by rule of law, by principles that Matthew will talk about. And when you do that, people who have been really uncompetitively successful for other reasons, aren't going to continue to be unless they change. Zebras and stripes and all that. But I think there are glimmers of hope on the horizon, and I, like a lot of other people, and the Ukrainian people in the first instance, are giving President Zelensky the benefit of the doubt. And I think you're seeing that with statements from Volker and others to say, okay, this is really important. These next 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 months, 4 months are going to decide what the future of Ukraine is like, and let's try to do everything we can to seize on that opportunity. So 1 year ago, I was optimistic. We were all optimistic. President Poroshenko did not carry through on the things that he said he would about a year ago now, and the result is Aleks. You can draw a straight line from the failures of the Poroshenko administration, who I wanted to succeed and did a lot of great things, by the way. The diaspora and people outside of Ukraine voted for Poroshenko, not overwhelmingly, but in a majority. Why? Well, because we don't live the day-to-day problems that his failures accounted for. The language stuff is great, the religious stuff is important, the war is important. A lot of other people, I think, in his position could have carried through on those things. But critically, a lot of other people couldn't have, so he deserves absolute credit for doing good work in those areas. But he didn't do work in the area that he was elected to do. And the revolution wasn't about a war with Russia, it wasn't about atonement, it wasn't about language, it wasn't about any of these things. It was about reorienting the country's economy and doing business in a clean, transparent, modern, Western way. So far, we haven't seen that for the most part. And what's changed for me personally, as someone who's been working in Ukraine, as Ambassador Popadiuk suggested, is that I've found someone, after a lot of hard work, who I believe can show a model for new business in Ukraine, reform business in Ukraine. But before I get to that, I wanted to start with something that I didn't expect to talk about today. But earlier this week, I was at a talk in New York by former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter, who's promoting a book, a fantastic book. I just jotted down the name. What is it? Inside the Five-Sided Box, the Pentagon. So Ash Carter is an incredibly smart, brilliant person. I mean, nuclear physicist, Assistant Secretary of Defense, thoughtful, understands the world and how it works, I think, personally, and was deeply respected in Washington. Talked about a lot of things during the talk because it was a wide audience, but I was fortunate to have an opportunity to ask a question at the end. And that question at the end started with a statement that I'll provide here. And that statement was, it seems to me, as an outsider looking in, that the US and the West more broadly have a problem dealing with countries where the government action and the business action aren't separated because they're not actually separate. Those countries are primarily Russia, they are China, to some extent they're also Saudi Arabia and Iran and North Korea. All these trouble spots are places where government action is taken in concert with business action. The Soviet Union used to do the same thing, but they didn't pretend to have a separation of powers between government and business. It was one thing. Russia hasn't changed, they just changed what they call it. They haven't changed how they do it. And China has changed a lot and is a little bit different than Russia, but in that respect it's actually exactly the same. Chinese issues with 5G and Huawei, something that is at the top of everybody's minds in Washington D.C. right now, are absolutely a concern. But we have a problem competing and dealing with them, not because we don't have good financial or good telecom equipment. We make good telecom equipment. Not because we don't have financial institutions that can take a forward-looking investment strategy that's part of foreign policy. We have those things. But those things are uncoordinated, right? So if you want Ericsson or someone else, or a bank or OPIC or any of these other institutions to do something, you have to convince 5 different boards or 6 different boards that it's in their long-term strategic interest to do that thing. We don't do a very good job of that because those 5 different boards are thinking about their short-term commercial interests. And the same problem carries through other sectors and other economies, but 5G is probably the best illustration. Huawei and China make long-term strategic decisions that it is in our interest to put 5G telecommunications equipment in places. Eventually that has a payback because people pay for the use of that equipment. The payback is determined by the time horizon, but we look at shorter time horizons, China looks at longer time horizons, and they coordinate their activities between business and the private sector in order to achieve a strategic goal, which is also a business goal, right? They're not doing it for free, they're doing both at the same time, but they're doing it in a coordinated way. So what is that, how is that relevant to Ukraine? Quickly to tie back to Secretary Carter. I pointed all of that out in a more concise way. And you know, he responded actually to my surprise, saying, you know, exactly right. That is the issue of our time. The issue of our time is our inability, and we're still struggling as the West, and the United States, to my mind, is the leader of the West. We're still struggling to deal with countries, Russia and China primarily, that take this coordinated action. In the case of Russia, they don't have a lot of successful businesses outside of Russia, but their disinformation attacks are coordinated. They're coordinated between their business people, and they're coordinated between their Kremlin, and they're coordinated for national policy and strategic reasons, and we don't respond well to them. Deripaska, whose name is all over the Mehrle report, is somehow allowed to do an investment in a Kentucky aluminum plant, and we think it's okay because he's just a business person. He's not just a business person, and they don't just act like business people because they're coordinated. They're part of the state. They've changed their labels, but they're behaving the same way. So how do we solve this? We solve this in Ukraine by trying to coordinate. Coordinate what Sovereign Ventures, new company that I'm involved in, is doing is trying to create a public-private platform for strategic cooperation, effective cooperation between governments and private sectors in Ukraine. You see a lot of people who understand the problem from 30,000 feet, but you don't see a lot of people actually coordinating and carrying that through to the ground because it's complicated, right? You get stovepipe solutions down from different companies. People are looking for their own interests, their own corporate interests, different countries' interests sometimes, but we're all in this together. So Ukraine can provide a model to fixing that, but in order to do that, you need Ukrainian businesses to be reoriented. So our strategic partner is a name that maybe some of the folks in this room are familiar with, but 1 year ago I wasn't. We've been working with Max Popadiuk of Newester Ventures, who has taken a company, a U.S. company called Firefly, which was a rocket company making launch vehicles that had been founded by an American, former NASA, SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic. Then he made his own company. That company went bankrupt. And Max, who's made a lot of his money in IT, bought that business out of liquidation and reoriented it, combining it with Ukrainian research and development technology, has invested over $100 million of his own dollars in order to make that company a competitive one. And they're on schedule to now launch from either from Vandenberg Air Force Base either late this year or early next year. Governor DeSantis of Florida has announced a $52 million spaceport facility for them at Cape Canaveral. And this is a U.S.-Ukrainian business where you're taking more efficient cooperation between the public sector, the private sector, governments of Ukraine, and governments of the United States, and carrying it forward in a way that's strategically important for both the U.S. and Ukraine, and critically important for the national securities of both. You can do something similar in other sectors of the economy of Ukraine, in fact, across all of them. So our work with Max is focused on cybersecurity and identifying and countering disinformation, where you take a US thing, you combine it with Ukrainian things, you add some money and know-how and smarts and expertise, and then you make it better, right? Not that you sell US products or services to Ukraine, but Ukraine has things to offer as well. This would be true in the 5G space as well, where you could do a cheaper protocol level development to either patch the Chinese equipment, or if you're thinking long-term, reorient a lot of our supply chain, which is part of the problem with 5G. Even if you wanted to buy only American stuff, you can't, because a lot of the parts are sometimes manufactured in China, and China puts back doors in them and things like that. But you need to find a place to manufacture that's friendly, right? And Ukraine could be that place, just as an example. Just as it's cooperating in the context of space with Firefly, is something that it could have done 25 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, but so far hasn't done. This is the first time that the State Department has given a TAA for joint research and development with a company, and you're getting a smaller, nimble company alongside an old state enterprise that frankly hasn't been getting the job done well enough. You can multiply that across different sectors of Ukraine, and even some more basic ones. So I'll end with the idea that has been bugging me. I'm not an oil and gas person or an expert in those things, but I think you could do something similar with one additional step to what Max has done and Newosphere has done with Firefly with the gas pipeline. There, the additional step is you need to take the process with Firefly is basically you take an American thing, you combine it with Ukrainian things, you invest, you make that better, and you build a more stable, efficient, successful business alongside a former Ukrainian unstable, inefficient, and eventually failing business or strategic asset. So in this step, you need to take the gas pipeline, I think, and make it American. Give it to Exxon for $1. I don't know if that's possible, but I'm sure we can figure out ways to do that. Have it be an American asset, have the Ukrainians manage it and run it, and I think immediately you'll have a more valuable asset that helps the United States from a strategic policy perspective, and Ukraine speak more effectively to the issues that are raised by the Germans, who are insisting, among others, on Nord Stream 2. The key to all of it, though, and whether it's the Firefly scenario or the cybersecurity scenario that I'm talking about and that we're working on through Sovereign Ventures with Newosphere, and the gas scenario, which is a hypothetical one, but one that I figured I'd use this platform just to talk about and put out there, is that you need to coordinate better. We need to coordinate better between our partners and our allies, because our adversaries are doing it. Our adversaries are doing it all the time because they recognize there's a long-term payoff for them. There's a long-term payoff for us, maybe not as quick or short-term as we've gotten accustomed to thinking here. You hear probably pretty often that boards and companies think maybe 1 or 2 quarters in advance because they have to hit their earnings targets. The Chinese are thinking 20 years in advance. So if we're determined to continue thinking 1, 2, maybe 3 quarters, maybe a year in the best case scenario in advance, I have a news flash for everybody. We're going to lose, right? You're going to lose that fight, and you're going to lose it with Russia because Russia's objective is not just to build successful companies. It's just to make us weaker, and they're doing a damn good job of it because in the areas that they're focused on, they're coordinating and we're not. So I second what I expect we'll hear from Special Representative Volker later today, which is let's give President Zelensky a chance. Let's give him a chance to give the politicians and give the political environment in Ukraine an opportunity to change what's been there, reorient the economy, and help do productive long-term business with the strategic allies and so we can counter our adversaries, our shared adversaries together. Eventually that will be profitable, but it won't be in a quarter or 2. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Walter, for organizing this standard conference. It's becoming a bit of a tradition now, and an important pillar of the debate in Washington, so well done. And since we're in grading mode today, let me start by saying those of us who are the graders are also being graded by this young panel up here. So they're pretty tough customers, I can tell you that. So we'll have to get your input and direct input as the day goes forward. Let me start with, so I've worked on developing ethically based businesses in Ukraine, Russia, and Eurasia for over 30 years now. And I've done this in government as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce. I've done it as a business executive in the oil and gas and energy industry. I've done it as an FCPA lawyer, and I've done it as a civil society leader that formed an NGO devoted to business ethics and corporate governance. And so based on that cross-sectoral experience, what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to try to evaluate how well Ukraine is combining its pro-business reforms with its anti-corruption reforms. Because it is that linkage that, and only that linkage, that will help Ukraine succeed in winning a larger war, which is the information war, which is the struggle for reality, the reality of the market, such as it is, to triumph over perceptions of the market, such as they are. And so, with that criteria in mind, let me start by saying, and Anders did a wonderful job of listing this out, so I don't need to go into much more detail. But the fact is that Ukraine's reform record over the past 3 years or 4 years is very good in terms of the areas of progress that they identify as being essential, in terms of the institution building that they've done, in terms of the legislation that they've drafted and passed, and in terms of their embrace of open data. That's an extraordinary thing that the Ukrainians have done very well, and helped them, win global awards for Prozoro and other procurement reforms, as an example. Ukraine has increased its position in the Open Government Data Index to 24 in just the last year, which is a very good sign of recognition that in this world of big data, Ukraine can make a statement and can be very effective. And so I would also applaud Ukraine, though they did this belatedly and without, unfortunately, sending a strong signal to the market, but they did eventually pass the legislation required to create a specialized anti-corruption court. And they've now funded that court and equipped that court with several judges. And so the goal there, of course, is to tie together all these different institutions that are devoted to anti-corruption in Ukraine that have been built, but are nevertheless disaggregated a little bit. NABU, the prosecutor's office. The fight against corruption in Ukraine has remained very politicized. And so one hopes that the anti-corruption court becomes a way of crystallizing that work and being able to expedite justice and work around the fact that the judiciary system remains very dependent and ethically challenged. And so, of course, these types of reforms are very important for business, which is why one should focus on the linkage between anti-corruption, transparency, and business. The reason is because they create an environment for competition, which is what Ukraine already has in many different sectors, but it's an element that it needs across the economy, and to get to that point of better competition and better market behavior, these anti-corruption reforms are going to have to take much deeper root and achieve a type of scale that they have yet to achieve. And I'll speak to that in just a moment. The other thing that's worth mentioning is deal flow has increased. The pipeline of deals in Ukraine, big deals, ones that matter. thinking of the EBRD deal to create a wind farm that will produce 875,000 megawatts of energy and be able to create enough power for a local town. Thinking of the creation of the New Horizon Private Equity Fund for $200 million. That's especially important equity fund because they're focused on helping Ukrainian businesses who are export-oriented and who will help Ukraine compete in global markets, which is a significant part of the story that we hope Ukraine will be able to tell in 10 years of becoming a very globally competitive country. And the other thing that Ukraine is doing very well, I think, is visualizing. They're visualizing the future of Ukraine as the South Korea of Europe. They produced numerous reports, including this 2030 plan that was generated by a lot of experts. And while it may be imperfect in some ways and maybe politically driven in others, it's very important for this constituency and for everything we're trying to achieve to be able to say what we actually mean when we say Ukraine could be a super economy. What does it actually look like? And divorced from politics, with government not interfering. What are the technology clusters that will form in Ukraine? What are the export-oriented businesses that will thrive in Ukraine? Which supply chain should it be a member of? So that visualization is taking place, and the debate around the future economy of Ukraine has to focus on a model. And it's not that everybody needs to agree on one model, it's just that we need to be debating in macroeconomic and microeconomic terms, what does that model look like? And so Ukraine deserve very high marks in each of the categories I just mentioned. Individual anti-corruption reforms that have a pro-business benefit. Building these institutions. Creating more pipeline of deals. And visualizing an economic future. And so where we run into issues, and both Anders and Aleks have alluded to this very forcefully and compellingly, is that the issue of corruption risk in Ukraine is a systemic issue. It's a structural issue. And one has the sense, as you think about the reform agenda, and even here in Washington we do this, we sort of tick off the checklist. Have they completed the work on e-declarations? Have they established this court? We have our list of things that we want Ukraine to do. However, there's something missing from that analysis and the diagnostics, which is, structurally speaking, the economy is still owned, largely in the shadows, and there are numerous monopoly or oligopoly structures that run key sectors of the economy. The antitrust laws in Ukraine don't work to dismantle those structures, not yet anyways, not effectively. And in the larger world of anti-corruption sort of analysis and work, we now have the benefit of network theory. We now know much better than we did even 3 years ago that the capture of state institutions in a place like Ukraine is done by networks of people. It's just groups of people that form around common, interests and values, and they work internally in Ukraine, but they also work externally through their networks abroad. And so these networks are transnational. And so the idea that you can reform Ukraine by doing anti-corruption steps in kind of isolation without addressing this fundamental systems issue is misguided. It's not going to work. the whole is never going to be greater than the sum of the parts. You will continue to have higher external Russia risk as a result of allowing these networks to thrive. So you could even argue that everything you might do successfully could be undone in 6 months by a re-penetration of Russian networks into Ukraine. So Anders knows this world, and his new book speaks to this very eloquently in terms of how the fight against corruption is global, but in each country it's systemic. And we need to be much more focused on how Ukraine can take steps to dismantle networks. So in light of all this, I'm going to make 3 sort of final comments for you to consider. The first is that in order to do this structural work better, Ukraine has to start with better diagnostics, and it's going to have to sort of rethink whether it can take a more systems-based approach to fighting corruption in order to build the reform package to a point where the bad perceptions of Ukraine are just that. They're just bad perceptions. Right now, the perceptions that Ukraine is a risky place to do business are unfortunately very grounded in reality. And the reality is that there's a risk of success. You can go in and you can do very well, and your assets can be taken from you because the private property protections don't exist. And so to address this as a systemic issue is challenging for Ukraine because, number one, they're still stuck in the post-Soviet legacy that all reforms should be top-down. Number two, they're still choosing winners and losers in government. Number three, they still haven't created a network to defeat these networks. And that's where we in the West can be more helpful to them, using public-private platforms that exist, including this one, including Ukraine Invest, including the U.S.-Ukraine Business Council, including the Ombudsman's Office. There are many, many vehicles out there to do this work, to create a network, to defeat the networks. And then finally, Alex's presentation hit on a very fundamental point, which is what I would describe as sort of private sector-led techno-diplomacy. Ukraine's value added in the global economy, you should have no doubt about this, is in their knowledge and in their human capital. It is phenomenal. The talent level in Ukraine is phenomenal. And so to build on that, to become a center of engineering, IT, and other productive activities that are value added within Ukraine will position them much better in global markets. And so with those thoughts in mind, I look forward to the grading part of this. I think what I would add is simply that when I presented this set of problems to a group of students at Columbia last fall, and I said, look, think of this as a systems issue, and tell me something innovative. Come up with something that Ukraine could do that would be groundbreaking, not only in Ukraine, but globally, that would take all these different reforms, these disparate types of reforms, and put them into one stream of activity that would create scale and send a very powerful signal to global markets that they're ready for business. And what they came up with is interesting, and I'm just going to mention it to you. What they came up with is, why not ask the 1,000 most rich and financial and industrial business leaders in Ukraine to declare their assets, not only within Ukraine, what assets they own within Ukraine, but what assets they own globally. Why not take that kind of radical reform step? It sounds unrealistic. It sounds like, where would the political will come to do something like that? But that's the kind of major structural reform that is needed to get at this systems problem. Thank you.
for their insightful comments. Just to summarize, I think it's fair to say that we all here on the panel kind of agree that the past Ukrainian administrations fell short in terms of meeting the expectation of the Ukrainian peoples, most notably the Yanukovych regime, and we all know the story behind that. Secondly, there have been some successes over the past 20, 25 years in Ukraine, most noticeably, as Anders pointed out, the reorientation of Ukraine's trade toward the West, a number of legal reforms that have taken place, such as the pro-door procurement process. However, much more needs to be done, particularly in terms of the structural changes, as Anders also alluded to, in terms of the sovereign state organizations, in terms of restructuring them into privatization, land reform, etc. I think Aleks pointed out rightly the desire for new initiatives in order to think outside the box, as did Matthew. So we appreciate those. And I think we all end on a high note in terms of the expectations that we have for the Zelensky regime. It's an expression of the will of the people, and we'll see how it moves forward. And with that, I would like to just open the floor to a few questions before we start the grading. So if anyone has a question, please raise your hand. Let me know to whom you want to direct the question. Are you raising your hand? Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you. This is Mr. Åslund. We heard two messages. One is that good property rights and agricultural land rights are critical for economic development. We also heard that there are state actors like China and Russia, in which economic and political policy are melded. What are the political and economic risks for Ukraine if a large fraction of assets were acquired by foreign actors, such as Russia and Ukraine?
Is it on? Do you hear me? Yes, sorry. Yeah, well, basically this is prohibited now, so that it can't happen. There are still, let's see, is it 3 state banks, Russian state banks left, and they will be, they have declined, it's very strong, they have declined massively. So I think their assets have fallen from 16% of the total banking assets to 4%. There are relatively few Russian companies left. The most disturbing is that Alexander Babakov, former deputy speaker of the Russian Duma, owns, 10 regional electrical distributors. That's the most disturbing. But the Russian business is sharply being cut down. The big Rosan lost its one of its big aluminum works in Ukraine because of unfair privatization. You can do many things with Ukrainian courts. And the big remaining Russian interest, I would say, is Alpha Group, which I would consider private and not directly under Kremlin control, but that is a point open to argument. So if any Russian come in, that would be noticed. Mehrle bought assets in 2010 for a total of $10 billion. Half of Industrial Union of Donbass for $2.7 billion. Half of Zaporozhstal for $1.6 billion. And the rather big bank, Prominvest Bank. And essentially everything is bankrupt and lost after they poured about as much money extra into credits afterwards. So that was $10 billion lost. So the Russians have lost a lot of money. In Ukraine, Sberbank, which is Russian Sberbank, which is still left, has 80% non-performing loans. B2B, before it was dissolved, at 96% non-performing loans. You can't really do worse than that. That's really quite impossible. So the Russian, in this environment, the Russian investments that are there are gradually being squeezed out. by not necessarily very nice means, essentially sanctions in one way or the other. And so I don't see that as a threat.
I'm Alison Patchen with Africa Worldwide. My question is sort of directed both at something Anders brought up, the independent supervisory boards, and also in the anti-corruption space with Matthew. So there's a law in the books right now in which asset disclosure is also required by members of independent supervisory boards. And there's some concern that this kind of disclosure can cause undue pressure on those independent members. So I was wondering if you guys could speak to that issue and how we might, as an international community, trying to support independence of the advisory boards, but also transparency and disclosure, how we might address some of those issues.
Yeah, good question. This is a sensitive issue. We in Åslund have decided to do the declarations. The NAFTA Supervisory Board has decided not to do it. As a Swede, one finds it quite natural that all assets are public. In Sweden, in the Scandinavian countries, all assets are public. So we are used to do this. Every Swedish town has its local newspaper publishing each year. These were the richest people in our town last year. They owned this much, and they made this much. So all this has been publicly available since 1766. Denmark was slightly later. They only did it in 1771. And so when Ukrainians say that the declarations are completely unique, it's not quite true. It has been done earlier. Finland and Norway have the same. Norway even has a public database for all tax returns in the whole country. So you can read everything about it. I think that it should be done, and I think that the declaration has been a tremendous success, although it has not been followed up. To you who didn't follow it at the time, it turned out that the average cash holding of a parliamentarian in Ukraine was $700,000 in cash at home, while the biggest was one who had declared $69 million of cash at home. It was Igor Kononenko, the deputy factory leader of the Poroshenko bloc.
If I may,
I just turned on. He came and got me to come and fix the microphone, so I went in and broke him.
You have to turn the other one up.
No, no.
Oh, I think you can only have
They're just
one
turned
of
up.
them.
Yeah.
No, it's not green. Yeah, the green one. I
But
just turned
I
it down.
think mine off.
So Alison, it's an excellent question because it illustrates how politicized the anti-corruption battle has become in Ukraine, and how as the accountability levels increase and become stricter for those who are part of these networks that I described, those who are in government positions and need to declare their assets, and those who are tied in with state-owned enterprises, need to be much more transparent for the overall effort to introduce corporate governance into SOEs to succeed. So to require independent supervisors to disclose their assets is risky, and I think it's a good debate to have. I'm not going to sort of state a position one way or another. I'm just going to state that the risks around this are that they illustrate how, as the anti-corruption reforms begin to work, there will be a strong reaction against them. And the way that the Russian playbook works is to identify individuals and attack them and use information like this in a way that is weaponized. So a new independent director of a state-owned enterprise, for example, former Minister Abramovicius, who was just appointed a couple days ago to Prom, excellent appointment. One would hate to see him taken down by the fact that he's made some money in his investment banking career 10 years ago. And so it is a double-edged sword, and what the point I'm trying to sort of bring out from what you're saying is that while they make these anti-corruption reforms in a piecemeal way, if they're not attacking the underlying systemic issue, you're going to be stuck in these tactical battles, and it's going to cause problems for anti-corruption champions.
Let me add one thing here, that actually the big problem with e-declarations is that it's approximately as stupid as NBO regulations. It's all about the details and nothing about the essence. So it's how many pieces of real estate do you have, not how much is it worth, etc.
And we have to get into the grading process, so time for two last questions. One, two, so please.
My name is Pascal Krushenitsky. I'm a US correspondent for Ukrainian English language newspaper, The Case Post. This is directed to Mr. Murray, who mentioned the importance of network theory and the capture of state businesses, industries. I wanted to know how the network theory differs from the traditional Ukrainian and other post-Soviet states nexus of crime and corrupt politicians in the early days, backed by vicious violence of a mafia type. How is the network theory, these networks, how do they differ? Are they a more civilized version of that more brutal system?
The newness and the innovation around bringing network theory to study the diagnosis of anti-corruption risk in a given country is that it helps us start with the premise that it's not an isolated phenomenon, it's not one group or even one venal government official that may be perpetrating this. Rather, it's groups that have captured institutions such as law enforcement, such as the oil and gas industry, and other sort of regulatory bodies, and that it is in fact the operating system of the government. It's the way government is organized. And so, they're not neutral. They're not somehow more civilized in what they're doing. Quite to the contrary, they have introduced a way of making decisions that is oriented around self-enrichment of a group of people into the institutional flow of government resource allocation and decision making. So that's what they have done. And so to understand the nature of the challenge in Ukraine, which has, by the way, it has elements of this. They are not as bad as either Russia or China, analytically, in my view. Because Ukraine has embraced other things like open data. So the struggle is the battle is pitched. And the problem is that to win, it's one thing to win the battle with a reform here or there, but what you're really trying to do is win the information. What you're really trying to do is be able to set a tone with government being able to use the information of government as a public good, not as a private good, not as something that private networks can use. So I hope that answers your question. The question's a big one, and there are several new books written on what network theory brings to the study and the remedy for corruption problems. So I'd be glad to share that with you.
Let
me exemplify here. You still need 20 to 30 visas, signatures on various government documents, which is an enormous, complicated apparatus, and it means that many government meetings only become a matter of signing papers rather than discussing the essence, and that leads to all these problems. With how could you solve it? Well, it is a very good way to solve things if you can lubricate it in some way or the other.
And just to point out something that this question gave good opportunity, it seemed like there was a disjunction between something I was saying and Matthew was saying, but you've given me the opportunity to explain why that isn't the case. So on the one hand, I had said that the politics and business are intertwined, and you need the politicians to be active. And then Matthew said you actually want hands off. The issue in Ukraine is that the current system is filled with networks that are counter to business, right? You're actually not getting outcomes based on fair play, based on the best person, based on the best solution. And so government needs to be active to break those networks that lead to inefficient and bad outcomes for Ukraine and for the West. And then after that happens, you need hands off. So there needs to be an active role now to break those networks. And the second point I'd like to make is that the networks very clearly extend beyond Ukraine and beyond Russia and beyond China. I mentioned Viddy Pascal, I'll do it again. To me, it's absolutely insane that he should invest $200 million in a plant in Kentucky to save a project that was dead. And there's stuff been written about it, but to me that speaks directly to the problem that these networks are not isolated to Russia, they're not isolated to Ukraine, they're not isolated to China. They extend here, and the U.S. cannot, in this time, backslide on those issues. We need to recognize who the adversaries are, and we need to treat them as such.
We have a good discussion going. I'd like to continue it for a few more questions. We had a question back there, and then this young lady will wrap it up for us.
Yeah, but we're going to have to really wrap it up because we are now, I've just got received that we're going to get those 5 deputies, so we
All right, thank you. I have a comment and a question for the table. With a comment, with all deference to social democracy, from the viewpoint of U.S.-based reformers, I think it would be somewhat odd to recommend the Ukrainian government to start having everybody declare their tax returns. Because any oligarch will first say, until Trump declares his taxes, why the hell would I want to declare mine? Just as an issue of presentations. And I do think there's an issue, not just, there's an issue of public outcry over corrupt officials, but there also is a fundamental issue of privacy, which is something that in the United States in particular, we tend to value very deeply. So that, I think, needs to be weighed in the context of reform proposals. But a question I have, and based on Andres' great comment, it's very true that Russian business is being squeezed out of Ukraine ever since the revolution. But if you've noticed, who's coming in to fill the gap is the Chinese. And where they weren't present in Ukraine so much before the revolution, they're all over the place now. And I think that's an interesting challenge for the United States in terms of its economic support for Ukraine. And as this is the economic panel, the U.S. is all over social policy, various reform in Ukraine, but it's a matter of investment. And I think that's a bit of an existential challenge to the United States is what happens as more Chinese investment comes in, and what suggestions could we propose to the United States in terms of how does the U.S. in terms of investment strategy counter Chinese investment and influence in Ukraine?
Thanks, Mehrle. I think I tried to talk to that. The U.S. government, so I'm a little hopeful that the IDFC, sort of the reformation of OPEC and USAID, will have a hand in that. And it's been partially triggered on the surface, so this isn't me speculating, by the United States, I think, recognizing that they're doing a bad job countering China because Chinese investment banks invest for national policy and they coordinate with business, so the banks are funding the Huawei projects and things like that, and all the decisions are being made centrally. We can't quite move to that model, but if you take a look at what the sort of reorganization of OPEC and parts of USAID under IDFC, which I think comes effective on October 1st, and also doubles the amount of money from $30 billion to $60 billion, is part of a good start, right? And we'll see how that operates and how that works. But the short answer is also we need more of that. We need to coordinate better between our government, friendly allied governments, and businesses here and businesses there, doing business transparently, building good networks, because networks can work in both directions. They can be negative or they can be positive. positive, sustaining and supporting those networks, and we'll find that that's profitable. The post-World War II order has been very profitable for everybody who's been involved in building it, not the least of which is the United States. And we need to keep doing more of that rather than shirking away from challenges that are hard or take a long time. If that had happened, we'd never have the last 75 years of peace and prosperity that we've had, and we need to take that with that approach again, looking forward into this century and countering China and Russia, which are doing a really good job with that coordination. So I think it comes down to coordination and to pick up on that through building good networks.
Yeah.
Still need the grading also.
Yeah, let me say here, there was very little social democracy in Scandinavia in the 18th century. They were aristocratic states, and which is oligarchy, very much like Poland at the time. So this was exactly to fight oligarchies. This is a tried and tested method to fight oligarchy, and it should be done in Ukraine. And I can also note that Ukraine has gone very far. Right now there are 16,000 companies that are not fully declared as yet ownership, which is relatively little. In this country there are more than 2 million anonymous companies. And this is a major threat to democracy in the United States. Yesterday, therefore, the House Financial Services Committee voted with a big bipartisan majority for the Transparency Act of 2019, which will give all this information to FinCEN. So, and with regard to Chinese, just to Aleks, so far there's very little Chinese. But this is what you said, I think is worthwhile for the future.
Last question.
So thank you for the panel. My question is kind of a synthesis of what Aleks said and what Matthew said. With companies such as Firefly, you have like a network forming between the US and Ukraine, but most of these companies still remain in the US. And so how do we begin to serve, say, the talent within Ukraine by transferring these companies to Ukraine or building that network more strongly within Ukraine?
Yeah, so in the case of Firefly, they have over 100 employees in Ukraine. So it's a U.S. company combined with a Ukrainian company, where they built up a Ukrainian company around the U.S. nucleus. So if you think of that, why would that make sense? Usually if we're talking about these network and systemic problems, the U.S. should have a better starting point. So from my perspective, you take a U.S. thing, put it in Ukraine, you combine it with good Ukrainian things. In the case of cybersecurity, actually, the Russian attacks are one of those things, right? So the fact that Russia is actually attacking Ukraine persistently, both in the information space and in the cybersecurity space, is actually a good input. Because if people say if you can make it in New York, if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. If you can stop a Russian cyber attack or information attack in Ukraine, you can stop it anywhere. So we should learn from that experience. And the objective is absolutely to build up Ukraine and build up its economy and integrate it and create positive networks.
All right, thank you very much. That concludes our panel discussion and the Q&A session.
We need the grades. Well, for
I guess I'll start. This is always hard. It's a new semester, it's a new year. We're seniors now, or juniors, because it's the third revolution, and let's see what Zelensky does. So I think the grades for the prior year are in some respects not irrelevant, but it really is a new leaf, and I think the U.S. and everyone is approaching it that way. But I'd give it a C or a D. It hasn't been, the promises that have been made for 25 plus years now just haven't been fulfilled. And until someone fulfills them, it can't be higher than a C, I don't think. So I'll give it a C because I'm optimistic rather than a D.
Okay, what I didn't talk about, and I'm thinking of what Matthew later said, why is Ukraine so oligarchic? Well, because only the oligarchs are strong enough to stand up against the predatory state. I look upon the state as the main problem. And if very few people stand, they get a lot of monopoly rents. So it's really a question of reining in the state and make it a better function, which goes over to the legal issue. I'm in two minds. If I look upon it in a narrow economic side, I would give a higher value. If I broaden in and take in the judicial system, which I think one should, it is a lower number. In the narrow B, in the broader C.
So I'm going to describe how I've graded, and then I'll give you the grade. First of all, I have 4 different metrics. One is on deal flow, I give Ukraine an A-. On individual reforms, I give Ukraine a B+. And then on reading the directions of the question, I give them a C, because I think what's happened is Ukraine has adapted to the demand that they reform by adopting imitation reform. And so they're kind of reflecting back to us what we want to hear as the teacher. And that's really not what we want them to do. We want Ukraine to fix Ukraine's corruption problem on Ukraine's terms. And so the 4th category is lack of critical thinking, where I also give them a C, because they're not looking at the issue as a systems problem, not yet, and therefore they're still thinking of fixing the Ukraine business environment sort of one deal at a time, one reform at a time. I think a great way of sort of wrapping this up is that I'm sure many of you have had this pleasure of interacting with Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, who's wonderfully charismatic about all this and always says to investors, you know, I'll be your personal bodyguard. I'll guarantee your investment in Ukraine. So while that is a wonderfully symbolic gesture on his part and speaks to his heart and his character, it also highlights the fact that that's what is needed is we don't want him to have to take on that role. We want him actually building new infrastructure in Kiev, and we want him doing what government officials should do, actually to stay out of business. We want government officials out of business, and we want them more broadly to focus on how these reforms are stronger in their linkage between anti-corruption and pro-business, and that these reforms add up to winning the information war, where we know there's always going to be risk that the Russians are going to come in and mischaracterize things within 24 hours. C+.
Yeah. I see my colleagues have vacillated between a C and a B and kind of compromise with a C+. Well, I'm going to move them a little bit forward and give you an overall B, and I'll give you the reasoning for that. There are 2 things I take into consideration in doing this grade. You have to look at the context in which Ukraine is operating. I'm mentioning these things not as an excuse, but as a reality in which the work is being done. The context that Ukraine is operating under is one in which, number one, they carry the baggage of the old Soviet mentality that they have to overcome. The second thing is you have to realize Ukraine is in the process of establishing its identity after centuries of basically enslavement. And the third thing is you have to realize that they're doing this in the context of an ongoing war with Russia, all of which impinges on the process, I think, of the process of reform, etc. The second thing that I would point to is the politics, something I started on. Politics and economics are intertwined. But if you look at the political situation in Ukraine, yes, there is an oligarchic system, but at the same time, Ukraine has had a number of peaceful elections, although marred in many cases. They've been peaceful. The exchange of power has been peaceful, and that in itself is a success that helps the economic system move forward eventually. So in that context, I think this broader context than just this sole economic context, in that context, I would just give Ukraine an overall B.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.